are built to superimpose on any moral system, if they're right about that, then there are aspects of utilitarian morality that we just can't internalize. Okay? It doesn't fit with the underlying psychological architecture. If that's true, big if that's true, I think it's enormously exciting and also the kind of progress that one couldn't get in thinking about morality, doing it in the traditional way that philosophers have for the last 2,400 years.
Let's go to Brad.
Hi. I was hoping you could maybe find a way to talk to each other a little bit on the general question of empiricism in the humanities. And I wondered if, listening to each other in particular, whether you began to get a sense that you were engaged in a project that is somehow related one to the other, whether you're engaged in very different projects. I can imagine ways to run it out with Franco's talk more easily since I'm in literature, but what you said at the end about the way that network seems to match up or support theories. Some theories struck me as interesting, given that when I've tried to imagine the move to networks, it's a move to sociology and away from, say, cultural anthropology. If we're doing cultural studies in the 70s, 80s with a cultural turn, perhaps now we're doing sociology instead of cultural studies. And what would be interesting there would be to remark that, well, if you're doing cultural studies, that had a paradigm shift in the conception of what it was that you thought literature was, being a text as part of a culture. But that's sort of a specific claim. I'd actually be more interested in hearing whether you recognized anything that you were doing in what Stephen was talking about, or vice versa. In other words, is there are we at some kind of empirical moment for the humanities?
Can we speak for the humanities?
I can sometimes not even speak for myself. But do you want to?
Well, we obviously, I mean, it seems to me that yes, we clearly have, I don't know, for me, when I was trying to put together that final page, and all of a sudden, I'd never thought in those terms, honestly. I mean, I always thought, okay, there's enormous work that has been done, especially in the 20th century, with which literary theory has tried to have nothing to do at all. And that has been the stupidest thing we could do with ourselves. And it's a matter of, for me, much of my adult life has been an exercise in catching up with stuff that seemed very interesting, very fertile, that was being done. And I was trying to learn and see to what an extent that changed literary things, the study of literature. And at first, I was justifying that to myself and to others by saying, "Oh, this is a completely new way of or a new way of looking at things." Blah 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 blah. But I was doing maps and graphs and putting, a sentence from Shklovsky or Barthes sort of as a little codicil to the thing. And so it was, only very recently, as I was working at this paper, all of a sudden I thought, no, this is not so much importing something that tells us stuff that we absolutely do not know how to do otherwise. This is importing models that are very good at sifting what has been done well from what has been done poorly. This is how I would now defend interdisciplinary work, as a sort of minos, an external judge that sort of manages. I don't know whether anything like that has any correspondence in how you look at the matter. And especially models from the sciences, of course.
Yeah, the metaphors don't immediately resonate. That my picture of, in my part of the intellectual world, is that there are sort of two different kinds of questions that philosophers have dealt with in normative areas where the empirical stuff is clearly relevant. One class of questions are questions that everybody who's thought about it clearly for the last 2,500 years has recognized is an empirical question. And where we just didn't have the wherewithal to answer the empirical question until recent methods in experimental psychology, neuroscience, experimental economics, and so on. For example, the question of whether human beings can be genuinely altruistic. Not that they can help one another, that's obvious, but can you help other people without having, as it were, an ulterior motive or not? Well, we tend to think of it in terms of Hobbes's claim that no, there isn't any real altruism. You're always after something for yourself. A similar debate can be traced all the way back to the ancients, so it's been with us for 2,400 years. But that's clearly an empirical question. Okay? It's a question about the nature and possibilities of human motivation, and everybody since Plato has recognized that it's an empirical question. What's new in the last 30 or 40 years is that we've begun, and we construed broadly, that is to say people in the social sciences, particularly in experimental psychology and developmental psychology, have begun to get a handle on how you could address that question empirically rather than doing what philosophers have done for 2,000 years, which is to swap anecdotes that don't persuade anybody. Okay? One of my real heroes, I think one of the great experimental philosophers of recent years, isn't a philosopher at all, but is the social psychologist Dan Batson, who I think, indeed have said in print, has contributed more to the debate about altruism in the last 30 years than philosophers have contributed in the last 2,000 years. But it was always clear that it's an empirical question that needs to we just need better methods on. Another range of questions are questions where I don't think we can settle them empirically. What the empirical findings do, in effect, is, and I notice you used a metaphor like this, reconfigure the landscape, the terrain on which the battles are fought. So things like the extent to which moral disagreement would disappear under idealized circumstances. I don't think empirical research in principle can settle that question. What it can do is make clear how expensive it is to continue to maintain a positive answer by making clear, for example, that you've got to really idealize in an extreme way to defend yourself against certain empirical findings. So those are the ways, on the one hand, reconfiguring the terrain. On the other hand, questions that people have always recognized in moral theorists from Plato onward have recognized are empirical questions, but having new methods to address them. One completely orthogonal point, and I only met Franco a few hours ago. We haven't had an opportunity to discuss this, but there may be a commonality that's not substantive but sociological here, which is, and so I'll address this question to you. Do you feel the need, metaphorically, to wear a flak jacket?
Wear a what?
A flak jacket.
What is a flak jacket?
Something that protects you when people shoot at you.
No.
You don't. Because in my part of the intellectual world, there are many people, including some colleagues here at Rutgers, who are enthusiastic and supportive. There are many more who hate this stuff, and where it's viewed as whatever the modern secular equivalent of the devil's work is.
There's two different questions there, though, because your question is, are people shooting at you? And your answer is, I don't feel that I need to wear any protection. I don't mind if people shoot me. So people are shooting at you, don't you think?